Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Abhinav Asthana. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Postman. I will be presenting this webinar with my co-host, Joyce Lin, who is our lead developer advocate, and our VP of marketing, Nick Tran. And in this webinar, we'll be talking about how can you transform your business into an API-first business. Just a few housekeeping things. This webinar will be recorded and will be available to you at a later date. We'll also be doing a Q&A at the end, so you can send in your questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. We'll also be doing a survey at the end of this webinar, and if you want to win an Amazon gift card, feel free to fill out the survey. So let's begin. So at Postman, we have been tracking, how technology has been changing over the past 2 decades. And we noticed some key trends, and we have categorized those trends into 3 major shifts in technology. So the first shift is in consumer technology, where consumers are using software more, moving from desktop devices to mobile devices. Mobile devices have exploded in popularity, and most consumer software is built for your phones or your iPads. The second shift that has happened is in the way system architects build applications. And that transition has gone from monolithic architectures where an entire application was packaged as one binary and deployed on a server to a more modular microservices architecture where you can have tens, hundreds, or thousands of microservices being independently deployed and working together to give consumers the experiences that they want. The advantage of microservices has been that you can deploy them independently, you can change them, you can sometimes even acquire additional functionality from the outside, and you don't have to build everything in-house. So that's a major trend that's happened in the just pure architecture of building applications. And the third major shift has happened in this movement from on-prem infrastructure to cloud infrastructure. With cloud infrastructure, you don't have to think about provisioning systems in advance. You can spin up serverless functions, you can spin up machines on the fly, and all of these things help you build APIs much faster. So all of these 3 trends put together is what we believe have led to this massive explosion in the sheer number of APIs that have been created over the past few years. And this trend is just accelerating. The pioneers in this field were companies like Amazon, Salesforce, and eBay, who first started with offering public APIs and also kind of building service-oriented architectures internally. And now we see essentially every company being an API company. We have hundreds of thousands of public APIs available from everything to a PayPal API to help you process payments, WhatsApp API to connect to WhatsApp and messaging services. There are also aggregators like Plaid who combine other APIs to give you the flexibility and the power that you need when you are building applications at your end. So this is a massive shift in the way technology is being created and consumed today. Unfortunately, while we have seen all of these APIs being created in huge amounts over the past few years, we still find that developers are often dissatisfied because of poorly built APIs. Not only are these APIs hard to use, they often don't work reliably. There are bugs in production systems, and when APIs change, a lot of things break for all the consumers of the API. And that creates a big trickle-down effect in the entirety of the whole software infrastructure. We have heard about how the S3 API went down, taking so many different applications with it. And those are just the more popular instances that we see. But when you have hundreds of thousands of APIs that you're building, it becomes a very, very hard problem to make sure that every API is a pleasurable experience for developers. And one of the fundamental things that we have seen as being the cause of that is this notion of disconnectedness between API producers and consumers. So API producers are businesses or development teams who are building APIs, and consumers are, of course, using these APIs to get their work done. What API producers face is, they encounter a lot of bugs during the development process or in the testing process or in the production process, things that could have been prevented earlier into the development cycle. There are a lot of disconnected tools that development teams use, they often try to stitch them together, and they don't really work very well. APIs are very critical to govern because they can expose data, or they can expose actions that you probably don't want everybody to do. So often producers lose sight of this, and it creates a lot of problems down the road. And for consumers, we have seen issues come up like it's very hard to get started with an API. People can't find useful documentation. It's very hard to eventually integrate an API for the end use case that they wanted to use the API for. So as we studied these trends and we looked at these problems that we are hearing from people who are building APIs and using APIs, we sense that most of these problems occur because APIs are developed at the end of the cycle of an application. And we call this generally like this ad hoc API last approach. Typically, you are as a developer, you're focused on getting the end use case right. You're trying to get some code up to production quickly. And what happens is that the API that your application exposes ends up becoming a wrapper rather than a well thought out tool. And that creates a lot of these problems that we discussed. However, what we see successful companies and development teams do is what we call the API first approach. So instead of thinking about APIs at the end of the cycle, or just kind of with the purpose of exposing some data or some applications at further into the production cycle, we believe that you can build really great APIs if you're thinking about them from the very beginning. And once you have a well thought out system and a well thought out strategy to build APIs through the entire life cycle of you supporting your development teams and your consumers, you will benefit a lot from all the power that APIs bring you without any of the issues that we just discussed. So how can you transform from an API last business to an API first business? Well, the first thing that you would like to do is streamline your individual API producer and consumer life cycles. So we charted them out looking at our experience of working with hundreds of different development teams. And typically the API producer lifecycle goes through like this. You are defining your API, and once you've defined your API, you go to write some code. Once the code is written down, you go through the cycle of debugging the code and updating it over time. In parallel, once the API is in good shape, then you are testing the API and you're probably integrating it into your CI/CD environment. After a little bit and sometimes concurrently, you are also writing rich documentation for the API. Once your API is in production, you would be monitoring your API to see that it's behaving as you defined it to be. And once the API is ready to be shared with others, you eventually publish your API. On the flip side, once consumers get a published API, they have to figure out what this API is, and they have to find the API because in their worldview, they have to discover an API from a place where they can search for it easily. Once they find the API, probably through documentation or through a portal, they have to understand the API and see what the objects are, what are the paths, what are the endpoints, and how can they fit the API into their workflow. After those things have been validated by the consumer of the API, you have to access the API. And that's where authentication comes in. the consumer has to register either their application or get a token, and they have to get to this point, what we call the first call to an API. And once you're in and authenticated, then the consumer is going to discover all the endpoints. They're going to make multiple requests. They're going to figure out is the use case really fitting in. And once that is done, they'll be integrating the API into their application or building new things as a composition of different APIs together. So the first thing for you to do is figure out where you are in your producer cycle and how the APIs that you're producing are used by your consumers, and where do they get stuck? Is it at the discovery phase? Is it at the authentication phase? Or on the producer side, are you not thinking about automated testing, or are you thinking about APIs last and you're not defining the API up front? So all of these touch points are a map from us to help you guide and streamline your development process. At Postman, what we see is that you can get another order of magnitude improvement when you actually bridge the default gap that exists between producers and consumers. So if you can get feedback early into the cycle of defining the API from consumers, you will eventually end up with a better API. As your API is changing over time and you're adding endpoints, you're versioning your API, the feedback that you get from your testing teams, from your ops teams, and again from your consumers can help you iterate much faster and help you build a better API. One of the key maxims that we follow and we advocate for is an API should be designed for change. There is no way that you can actually spec out an API in such detail that everything that will ever be done by that API will be done in the first version itself. So you have, once you bridge the producer and the consumer lifecycle together, what you're also seeing is your ability to respond to this future change that you just have to account for. Teams that struggle with API development often don't account for that change. And what happens is that consumers then get frustrated. They don't see updates happening onto what could be improvements from their perspective. And producers also struggle because they just don't have this information. And sometimes they have too much information, and there is so much information that you can't really figure out like which things to prioritize. And these things also happen again between these two producer and consumer cycles independently. Interactions between development teams and testing teams, between testing and ops teams, and even from business teams, your product managers, your directors who are invested in the API as a product or as a business, they also need to have rapid feedback cycles to make sure that things are on the right path. And the final point that I'd mention is that once an API goes in and you have, depending on how much you want to satisfy your consumers, as the moment an API goes in production in somebody else's system, typically producers have to support that API for a very, very long time. So it's so how do you kind of balance that? That you don't want to spec out everything in the beginning, while you also want to make sure that you design for change. Bridging these two life cycles together is what we have seen most successful companies do really well. So we have been building Postman to help you transform from an API last business to an API first business. Some of you might have been using Postman as an application for a while, but hearing from you over the past few years, we have been extending Postman both in its sheer depth as well as its breadth to give you a complete platform for building API first businesses. And as you'll see, it's a stacked layer with multiple features available for you for each stages of your API lifecycle. The way we see it is this layered architecture for you to consume, and it begins with the Postman runtime that some of you might be familiar with. The Postman runtime gives you the ability to send requests, build collections, store examples, and that's where, if you're a developer, that's where your day-to-day activity around around building the API or consuming the API code. As you evolve into the engineering process of an API, Postman gives you lifecycle management tools for building your API schema, building automated tests, helping you build a beautiful looking documentation. You can also prototype your API with mocks. And if your API is in a staging environment or in the production environment, you can monitor your APIs using Postman too. And on the Postman API platform, you not only can work as an individual, but you can also collaborate together in teams through our collaboration features. So you can use workspaces for any of the tools that are available in Postman, and you can invite other people together. You can comment with each other. You can get those feedback cycles started. We have powerful version control capabilities built for APIs and for documentation and tests within Postman. So not only your developers, but also your business teams can interact and give feedback confidently without breaking your code base. And if you are an enterprise company who values security features and compliance features, we have powerful role-based access control features and single sign-on and audit logs to help you deploy the Postman API platform securely. The platform is available through multiple interfaces. We have the Postman desktop app. Postman collections can be run through our CLI. And of course, we have an API as well to help you integrate the platform with your other tools. We also have some pre-built integrations that you can get out of the box. And finally, if you have a public API, you can use the platform to get your developers for your API be onboarded faster through the Postman API network. So the Postman API platform is designed to give you 5 key advantages. I'll go through them in a little bit more detail in subsequent slides, but in a nutshell, we help you discover, explore, and utilize APIs faster. We help development teams build higher quality APIs. As I mentioned, Postman's platform has powerful collaborative capabilities, so you can collaborate in small teams, large teams, or across your entire organization. Postman also helps you build a secure, governed, and compliant APIs, so you can be sure that the ones that you're designing are the ones that exist in production, and you can also ensure that the design of your hundreds of APIs is intact according to policies that you want to define as an architect. And finally, if you have an internal API or a partner API or a public API, Postman's tools can help you drive the adoption of your API. Because if you've built an API, you want it to get used as much as you can. So how do you do that? So the journey for most people on the Postman API platform begins with downloading our free app for the macOS, Windows, and Linux platforms. If you don't have an API to build, you can discover APIs through our API network and get started with playing around with some APIs. Or if you're already building an API, you can just start with sending a request. And we support multiple formats like REST, SOAP, GraphQL, or anything built on top of HTTP. We have powerful features to help you send requests, get responses. And if you don't want to send requests one by one, we have our Postman collection format to help you execute them in one go. And if you are integrating the API into other applications, you can use Postman's code generation features. And we have code generation available for more than 20 languages to help you make sure that this translation from Postman to your application is super, super easy when you're sending API calls. The second advantage you get with that platform is building higher quality APIs. We have powerful tools to help you prototype an API using formats that you already have adopted. These are industry standard formats like OpenAPI and GraphQL. Using Postman's latest features, we actually help you validate Postman collections against these specifications. And within collections, you can write powerful tests or chain together integration scenarios. You also get reporting capabilities in our CLI as well as our monitoring tools to track the health and performance of your APIs. Most development teams need to collaborate faster, and you get that out of the box with Postman. You can set up workspaces and teams and give them specific roles to make sure that the right people have the right access. You can reuse collections, you can put comments. Postman has inbuilt version control to help you track changes to your APIs. And we also have integrations for anything that's happening inside Postman with tools like Slack. And as you're building these APIs, you would want them to be secure and compliant. With Postman, you get a centralized repository of all your API specifications, which can then be applied to all your tooling within Postman or outside of Postman. You can do contract testing with Postman collections. We also have designed the platform in a way that helps you work securely. These are features that we'll talk about more in our subsequent webinars. You can automate all of these things that you do in Postman with your CI/CD pipeline, as well as a monitoring service. And finally, once your API is ready, whether it's an internal API or a partner API or an external API, you can use Postman's features to help you drive API adoption. We have powerful documentation capabilities that you can generate at the click of a button. If you have an existing developer portal, then you can integrate Postman through the Run in Postman button. You get a lot of tools in Postman to spec out your API examples. And all of this is available either in the JSON format or through our API to help you integrate with the existing tooling that you might be using for documentation with the rest of your software lifecycle. All right. With that, I would like to hand this over to Jocelyn, our developer advocate, and she'll take you through a demo to take you to help you see what the platform looks like and how it works. Over to you, Joyce.
Thanks, Abhinav. Hopefully you see Postman, your friendly neighborhood Postman, and not this game of solitaire that I was in the middle of. Okay, no one will confirm. All right, so hopefully you see Postman. Welcome to this webinar. Again, my name is Joyce. I am the developer advocate, but today I'm getting a promotion. So today I am the VP of Engineering, I am the CTO, I am the Chief API Architect. I'm the one who is responsible for designing and developing my company's APIs. So how can my company use Postman to be more API first? Let's start with something most of us are familiar with. So here you should see your friendly neighborhood Postman, and you have your collections here on the left. So you're using collections probably today to document, test, mock and monitor the behavior of your APIs. And you can see that we're right here documenting the user's API. We're telling others how to use these endpoints. So we know about these types of collections. Let's talk about my first challenge as the VP of Engineering. So as the VP of Engineering, I know that APIs are made by humans. So when you're collaborating on APIs, you end up having human problems. When you're working with other people, there's miscommunications. Sometimes you break somebody else's workflow, and sometimes you just don't know what other people are working on. So one thing that we see here in Postman is that we have our collections. We're also using workspaces. So this is a way to organize your work. Here we're looking at a workspace called Identity Service. It's a team workspace, but you can organize your workspaces by function, by build environment, or even have secret projects. So you can actually create private workspaces that are hidden from everyone else. So with team workspaces, say you want to get help on documenting this user's API. If I go over to users, I can go over and manage the roles, and I can see everyone in my team that's been helping me out on this endpoint. And maybe I want somebody to help me out with the documentation. Claire's a pretty good writer, so maybe I can go ahead and grant her a role called editor, and she can actually do the documentation in Postman. But Claire's been off her game lately, and I think she's going through some things at home. I don't actually trust her, so I'm gonna leave her as viewer. And what Claire can do now is she's a viewer. She can come in and view this documentation, and she can actually create a fork of this collection, do her work, and when she's ready to present her work, open up a pull request. And since I have editor access, I can go ahead and review her changes and merge them. So this is like Git, but inside Postman. There's a couple ways to use workspaces and grant access to people to the assets in your workspace. And so workspaces here are an unopinionated solution for some of these human problems. It's unopinionated. You can organize them. You can use them however you want. But now I'm the chief architect. Let's talk about my second challenge as chief API architect. So I have a little bit different challenge. As the person who's designing the API or responsible for how they're designed, I have opinions. Workspaces are unopinionated. I have opinions that I want enforced. So again, APIs are made by humans, so we have more human problems. People aren't really sure about the single source of truth, and sometimes they're building things that people don't want. How can I establish a single source of truth and make sure that there's governance around the design and development of APIs? So in Postman, we have, you've probably seen this tab here, APIs. I'm gonna go ahead and load up one of my APIs called Users API. And I'm streaming Netflix right now, so it's a little slow. Or maybe it's the Zoom. It's probably the Zoom causing this. Okay. So in Postman, what we see here is a user's API, and I'm actually drafting a spec of my API in Postman. So here we're using OpenAPI version 3. And so you can either draft and create these rules about how your API will be developed, or some people choose to work off of an existing OpenAPI or specification file, and you can import those files. So here I've set up a sync, a two-way sync, between my source control and this OpenAPI file. So what I'm doing is if I make any changes here, then I can go ahead and push those changes to, I'm using GitHub here. I've synced it with GitHub. Or if other people are working on the specification file in GitHub and they make a change, I see the most recent version here in Postman. So you have this two-way sync here with GitHub in this example. And there's a lot of stuff on this page, and maybe you're just getting started with API specification. So what I would call your attention to is just the Define tab, the Develop tab, Test and Observe. This right here is the API first lifecycle. So if you're producing APIs and you're using an API first approach, this is the lifecycle that you're going through. And all of these Postman resources generated from this specification are bounded by the user's API. You can see that we're developing mocks from the specification, documentation, tests, monitors, observability, so you understand the behavior of your APIs and whether or not they're behaving as you expect them to. So because you've defined the API on this tab, now all of these resources that are spawned and generated from that API, Postman will sync them. And this is what Abhinav was talking about earlier. Postman has a view now that keeps those resources spawned off of the specification in lockstep. So you can actually validate against that schema that you've defined. And in fact, if I go over to collections and pull up one of the requests, I'm in Postman like I'm familiar with, and I'm putzing around, tweaking things. And when I go ahead and send, I can go ahead and continue that work, but Postman sees an issue. Up here, this badge, Postman is validating this request and the activity that I'm doing here against users API 1.1.0. And in fact, it's saying there's a required query parameter that's not found. So I can actually click down and drill down and make sure that my activity and the stuff that I'm building off of that specification file is in sync. So you have that two-way schema validation. One view is from when you're doing the work and executing those calls. And then the other view is at a macro level in the validation. You can actually click through and then make sure, run that manual check to validate. So as I'm continuing in Postman, I'm making changes, I'm developing, I'm documenting, I'm writing tests. As I'm making these changes, I can actually version the API as well as the collection. So here I'm incrementing my versioning. And in fact, if I have a baby version, I can go ahead and port all of those resources spawned from that specification over into a new version. And this is a better way to keep track of things, but also if I want to roll out a 2.0, I can more intentionally roll out changes without breaking someone else's workflow. So this versioning I can do at the API level as well as at the collection, the resource level. Okay, so in Postman, APIs here, I'll click back over to this tab here. APIs are the single source of truth. So just like for collections, APIs have versioning, version control, roles and permissions, lots of ways to make sure you're not breaking other people's stuff. Okay, let's talk about my third and final challenge as the head of product, El Jefe, the big cheese. So now I'm the head of product. I'm not really worried about breaking other people's stuff. That's not my problem. But because one of my challenges is that maybe I'm building things that no one really wants, and it's going slower than I'd like. So traditionally, with an API last approach, Abhinav was talking about this earlier, with an API last approach, you have to wait for development to get to a certain point before other consumers of your service, other developers, other testers, writers can begin. So with an API first lifecycle, you start off by defining the API. So what does that get us? Starting with the API specification gives you a faster feedback loop. So we already took a look at, I think we saw earlier, some comments. So once you have this API specification, it's a proposal. It's very explicit. It describes exactly how you want your API to function, and it's a proposal. And stakeholders and potential consumers can weigh in on it and give you immediate feedback. Once you agree to the details of the implementation, the API specification becomes a contract or a handshake or a pact, and other teams can then start spawning and generating mocks, documentation, tests. They can start working in parallel off of this initial agreed upon contract. Okay, so I think there's one last thing I wanted to show you that Abhinav was talking about. So for the resources that you've generated, all of these collections, mocks, monitors, for the resources that you've generated from your API, Postman actually aggregates in-app activity. So when you're in the app and you're putzing around with those spawned off resources, Postman aggregates that and gives you a view of it. So if you look up here for this API, I have reporting. I'm just going to click over to this browser, the browser mode. I have an API pulled up here, and I can actually see the historical data of the in-app activity. And this gives us faster insights, and you have it at the team level, but also the API level, and you can see when something went awry and somebody spent time debugging or they're in active development. And you can start seeing how this type of information can begin driving a quality score. Okay, so to recap, couple of challenges here as El Jefe. Most of them are human problems. So collaborating, APIs are made by humans, and to help humans collaborate, you have workspaces. They're unopinionated. You can use them however you want. But when you do have opinions about APIs and you want them enforced, you use APIs as a single source of truth. And you have roles, permissions, versioning, and version control, and source control, and you have that pretty rad schema validation to keep everything in lockstep. And the last challenge, to make sure that you're building stuff that people actually want, get their feedback early, and use the specification as a contract, which then drives these resources. So you can work in parallel instead of the traditional waterfall development. And that's all I had to show you today. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Nick, who was our head of marketing. There's a bunch of different ways to do API first. He's gonna share some of the ways industry leaders have moved to an API first approach, and he has an exciting product announcement too. Over to you, Nick.
All right, thank you, Joyce. So really, really great demo. And as your direct line manager, congrats on your promotion of VP Engineering. I'll have to celebrate with a virtual beer later. So hello, everyone. My name is Nick Tran. In this section of the presentation, I'm going to share some benefits of the Postman API platform, as well as share with you some customers and stories around Postman. And we'll have, and as Joyce mentioned, we'll have some really exciting announcements at the very end. So hot off the press, the Enterprise Strategy Group recently surveyed a bunch of Postman customers about the benefits they're seeing while using Postman. So what they found is that our customers are actually seeing huge benefits from building their APIs on Postman. So upwards of 5 times faster API development. 4x faster bug fixes, and 10x more effective API collaboration. So net, adopting Postman as your API development platform can really dramatically speed up your API development and help you build higher quality APIs that developers love. So I'm going to share with you now a few of these customer stories of examples of companies that are transforming into API-first businesses with Postman, starting with Ping Identity. Ping Identity provides identity security solutions that help enterprises safeguard customer and employee data at scale. So remember that depiction of API chaos. That's essentially what they went through prior to using Postman. So individuals on the PingOne team were using a variety of different tools from different vendors to use and manage all their APIs. This, of course, made it difficult to standardize all their API processes and didn't really allow them for team working efficiency. So for the PingOne team, they chose Postman to be their hub for all things API, enabling collaboration throughout their entire API lifecycle, from development to QA testing to customer onboarding and documentation. Actually, if you go to their live PingOne developer site, you can see all their API docs there, which are powered by Postman. So another customer example, Better Cloud. Better Cloud is a provider of SaaS ops solutions to manage and secure the digital workspace. So their platform offers REST APIs that help customers optimize and automate workflows, integrating with major tools like Google Office 365 and Slack. Believe it or not, their platform consists of hundreds and hundreds of internal APIs that power all of their microservices, which provides backend functionality for things like authentication and API ops tooling. Ultimately, the company decided that they needed something like Postman to centralize all of their APIs, to have their APIs become the source of truth for everyone working within their organization. One of their favorite features is Postman monitoring, which helps their developers and testers keep track of all their health and performance of their APIs, allowing them to easily review their API responses and availability with each of their runs. So not only have our customers told us how much they benefit from Postman, we're also recognized by analysts and the community as one of the highest rated API development platforms. So Postman has the highest ratings on Gartner's Peer Insights report for full lifecycle API management with a rating of 4.6 out of 5. Postman also has a 4.65 rating on G2 Crowd with over 300 reviews. So we're really proud to have such a high rating from analysts and from our customer community. But what we're really grateful for is the community that we have, with over 10 million users using Postman. So we're now one of the largest, if not the largest, API communities in the world, and possibly the entire galaxy. So, and also thank you to all the 500,000 organizations using Postman today. Now, everything that we have been sharing today, starting with Abhinav and Joyce, about API first, has been a direct result of listening to our customers. But to help you go even faster on your API first journey, we're excited today to announce that we are taking the limits off of building APIs within Postman. So no longer will there be limits on the number of APIs you create with API Builder, and no longer will there be limits on the number of APIs that you sync with GitHub. So as you start thinking about or transitioning into an API first development approach, we want to give you the flexibility to manage all your APIs within Postman without limits whatsoever. And to learn more about the nuts and bolts of API first development with Postman and the Postman API Builder, we actually have an upcoming webinar coming up next month, June 24th, with our product manager, Sanka, and our developer advocate, Arlemi. So you definitely save the date and check out that webinar. And one more thing. So once you build all your APIs, how do you go about sharing them within your organization? So coming soon, very soon, within the next couple of weeks, we're going to make available to you a private API network. So what this thing does is it allows anyone within the company to share their API with the rest of their organization. So this is this totally completes the loop from an API producer consumer lifecycle standpoint. So we've covered a lot, and I want you to, I also want you to encourage you to try out Postman if you haven't done so. You can download it from postman.com/downloads. Getting started is super easy. There's a bunch of built-in boot camps to help you navigate the Postman UI as well as the platform. To take it home, survey time. So you fill out this survey, you'll get entered into a drawing to win for a chance to win an Amazon gift card. It takes a couple minutes to fill out, but I highly encourage you to fill it out. And while you do that, we're going to transition now to Q&A. And with that, I'm going to invite Joyce and Abhinav back online to assist me.
Nick, I see some good ones here in the Q&A. I'd like to hear what Abhinav has to say about these as well. Do you want me to go ahead and ask some?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, I see one here that says, do you consider design and define as the same thing?
So the notion of API design, in our opinion, is a little bit more encompassing, and these are similar words, and I don't think the industry has settled on what the standard term is. Roughly in my case, it's the same, but in a general API design process, there might be things that you would be doing and you should be doing outside of the pure writing of the specification itself. So I would say design as a whole is a broader concept, and in a way, as you're going through your producer lifecycle, you are designing the API kind of all the time. But defining is when you kind of concretize that thing that you have as ideas and use cases and workflows into a specification, and that's what I would call a definition of the API in the define phase.
I have one question for you, Joyce. Does the Postman platform also provide a service to measure API execution performance and benchmarks?
Execution performance and benchmarks. During the demo, we saw a little glimpse of the reporting. I didn't show you all the screens, but you are able to see the activity. You can see essentially, let me just pull it up. I think response size, response time. So the same type of metadata that you see in the builder, you can actually create monitors that show you that, as well as in aggregate at the API level. So yeah.
Actually, I can add one more thing to it. Our friends at K6.io launched a really great integration with Postman. You can create Postman collections and import that into their open source tool to do large scale performance testing and benchmarking. Some of those things can help you extend what you're already doing, as Joyce mentioned, to do even bigger performance tests. I would highly recommend that integration.
So another related question would be, is there any way to retrieve information about users that interact with the APIs?
Not yet directly when you can link it to the APIs in the builder itself, but a common pattern that we see is users using shared workspaces, at least for internal APIs, to find out who's been working with an API. So if you want to get feedback on the API and you want to see what's kind of going on, I would recommend doing more work in shared workspaces. On a long-term roadmap, of course, we would support that capability as to kind of help you get more insight into just pure metrics from these consumers.
And something that I've seen other companies do, it's kind of like a homegrown solution, but since so many developers are working in Postman and using Postman to send their requests, sometimes through the API network that Abhinav showed us, they will actually be tracking the activity going through with like a user agent or like a little like custom header, rather, a custom header that tracks their activity in Postman.
Okay, thank you. So really interesting question here. How do you decide whether to build an API in Rust, so GraphQL, or any other modern format?
I'd say often deciding on the format is a second order kind of question. I think the first set of things that you would probably want to answer is who is the audience of my API that I'm building? Is if it's primarily a front-end audience, you might want to have a look at GraphQL because that's primarily designed for from the perspective of a consumer. And one of the things, and interesting things that we have seen is that API formats have opinions on who gets more power in this interaction between server and client. So REST is pretty unopinionated. It extends to so many different use cases, and frankly, has emerged from the way the web has evolved. So I think REST is the most evolvable paradigm, and we see that being the most popular. So if you pick REST, you are in very, very good shape. You can't go wrong there. With GraphQL, what we have seen is the specific objects and models inside it. You want to be sure that you can get them right. And GraphQL, of course, has evolvable mechanisms, but it does put more weight behind the front-end consumer being the ultimate arbiter of whether the API is working or not. And more technologies are coming kind of all the time. So my first suggestion to most developers and teams is that, okay, the performance throughput, the quality of experience that you want to deliver, first outline that, and then there are different ways to approach that problem depending on which technology you pick.
All right, thanks, Abhinav. So Joyce, you work with APIs all the time. So what do you think makes an API documentation good? And this question is from Benjamin.
API documentation is subjective. How good it is rather is subjective, but something that we do here at Postman is just ask all new people to create something from scratch. And if you can track the user journey and see where people are getting stuck and optimize it, if you can make the documentation an evergreen process, I think that's one key to begin with. But something we didn't show was the documentation in Postman. So something that I really like about Postman, not just because I work here, but is that collections are, yes, it's explaining for you how to interact with an API, but it's executable. It's right in front of you. It's in a tool that you're familiar with, and you're experimenting, and you're able to interact with the API in real time, and that helps you learn. So Postman as a documentation tool, yes, there's what we call official documentation, but just being able to interact with it, I think, is the new frontier of good documentation.
Yes. So related to that is code generation, and Juan has a question about, does Postman make boilerplate code for Node.js?
Why, yes, it does. Yeah, so again, there's so much that we didn't get to talk about today because we're talking about a very specific topic, but you can actually generate code snippets from your activity going on in Postman. And that is an open source project on GitHub, so that if you are working in Node, I think we have a few libraries in the code generators, but if you have a very hipster language that's new and coming, you can go ahead and add that language yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Joyce. I think we have time for one more question here. So Theo asked this question: can you help me determine if you would cover the point of view of a business is trying to implement APIs but not build them? I guess this would be the question around API consumption.
So if I understand it, Nick, right, is it like, do you want to like you're thinking about incorporating an API, but you don't want to go through the whole cycle of building it, right?
Yes.
You're trying to figure out yeah, I think that's actually, the build versus buy debate is something that I believe every business should have in the API economy. I mean, the beautiful thing about APIs is that now we have standardized on web protocols, and if a company that has specific domain knowledge of that API and has worked hard to make sure, Stripe and Twilio, for example, are common things that come up. You don't need to build like a messaging system. You can use Twilios and get to things faster. So we actually encourage that you should definitely look at what are the available options and things that come in when you're trying to take the decision is it are the rights that business actually when you consume somebody else's API from an external party, it's not just a technical decision, it's also a business transaction in a way. So what are the terms behind the API, how reliable it is, which company is backing it, what are the data import export rules there outside of the API. So once you kind of answer those questions, you can look at how that API is going to fit in with your needs over a long period of time. I'd say that's actually a great place to start. In some cases, if you feel like you have specific domain knowledge about that particular API better than others, then it would that's where you would probably want to start kind of building.
Yeah. Thanks, Abhinav. Actually, one more question. I really like this question since it's a product roadmap question. It comes from Vikas, who asked, is there any timeline for finishing the feature to provide a sync to other Git repositories like Bitbucket?
It's coming soon. I think is next week, I believe.
Wow, that's it. Okay. Do you want to share any more around like our roadmap around integrations?
Yeah, so we have a dedicated team working on integrations. We have charted out a ton of them that we want to build to extend the API lifecycle to all the software development tools that you're using. We love feature requests on that. Last year, actually, we focused on OpenAPI, GraphQL, RAML as key specification formats to support in Postman. Joyce talked about code generation that we did. And now we're kind of looking at other SDLC tools like gateways, repositories, APMs, all these things that help you operate APIs along with the rest of your application. So there is a ton coming soon, and we'd love to hear from you in our issue tracker on GitHub.
All right. Thank you, Abhinav. Okay, so that was the end of Q&A. Again, I want to just thank everyone for attending this webinar. We will be sending out the recording. Unfortunately, we weren't able to answer all the questions, but we'll do our best to follow up with each of you. With that, thank you, and stay safe and have a nice day.
Bye.